Your electricity bill went up this year, so did your water bill, so did the cost of your laptop, your phone, and if you looked closely enough at your retirement account last quarter, something in there shifted too. Quietly, without an explanation attached. None of those things seem connected, but they are. All four are being pulled right now by the same system, a system you interact with every single day, a system that nobody asked your permission to build at this scale, at this cost, drawing from the same grids and water tables and financial infrastructure that your life depends on. In 2024, analysts at Sequoia Capital did the math that nobody in Silicon Valley wanted to see on a whiteboard. If AI companies keep spending at their current rate, the entire industry would need to generate $600 billion a year just to break even, not profit. Or break even. That number is not what they're earning, it's what they need to earn. And the gap between those two figures is the size of a small country's GDP and growing. Right now, generative AI is making real money. Billions in annual revenue across companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. Analysts predict AI-driven profits could climb into the trillions somewhere in the mid-2030s. That future is possible, but the present is something else entirely. Anthropic scaled its revenue to hundreds of millions per month in 2025. Sounds extraordinary. Then you read the next line. It was also expected to lose billions over the same year. OpenAI locked in $10 billion of funding in mid-2025. Within months, it was back asking for another $8.3 billion because the money had already been swallowed by operating costs. And Elon Musk's xAI burning through more than $1 billion every single month just to keep running. That's not a startup problem, that's a structural problem, and it points to something the industry doesn't like to say out loud. Traditional software has a beautiful economic property. Once you build the product, adding users is almost free. That's how companies like Microsoft and Adobe turned into profit machines. The cost of serving the next customer is basically nothing. You write the code once, you sell it 1,000,000 times. Margins improve as you scale. AI breaks that model at the foundation. Every single time you send a message to one of these systems, something physical happens. Processors fire, electricity moves, cooling systems kick in, data travels across networks at enormous cost. The answer you receive isn't free. It has a price, paid by someone, somewhere, in kilowatts and dollars, which means that as more people use these systems, the costs don't plateau, they climb. In some configurations, they climb faster than the revenue coming in the other direction. The more people use it, the more expensive it gets. Now, here is where it gets genuinely strange. Despite all of this, roughly $400 billion in annual spending has already been committed by the largest companies and investment groups on Earth. AI growth speculation has become one of the core engines driving the S&P 500, which means your retirement account, the one sitting quietly in an index fund, is now exposed to the financial fate of a technology that hasn't proven it can pay for itself at scale. You didn't sign up for that bet, but you're in it, and the revenue figures themselves deserve a second look. A practice called phantom revenue has quietly become standard across parts of the industry. AI companies count API capacity commitments, contracts where a client agrees to spend a certain amount over the next year, as recognized revenue, even before the actual usage occurs. The same way Enron booked future profits as present earnings. It inflates the headline number, it keeps investors calm, and it makes the gap between what's real and what's reported significantly harder to see from the outside. So if the math is this clearly broken, why does every major CEO in tech keep doubling down? According to a recent survey, around 90% of chief executives believe AI will fundamentally change their companies by 2028. That's an almost unanimous consensus. But when you look at the financial data sitting underneath that confidence, something doesn't line up. Only 25% of AI initiatives are delivering their expected return on investment. 9 out of 10 executives say the technology is essential. About 1 in 4 can actually explain how it makes money. What that sounds like is not strategy, it sounds like fear. Each company watches the one beside it announce an AI-first strategy, rush out a product, order GPUs by the hundreds of thousands. And the ones who haven't done that yet look like they're falling behind, so they move. Not because the returns are there, because not moving looks worse. If this is the corporate version of a gold rush, nobody wants to be caught without a shovel. The problem is, most of the people buying shovels have no idea where the gold is. The company that profited most from the California gold rush of 1848 was not a miner, it was Levi Strauss, selling denim to people who never found anything. Today's equivalent is Nvidia. In the first quarter of 2024, its data center revenue hit $22.6 billion in a single quarter. The people rushing into the hills are spending. The people selling the shovels are printing money. The infrastructure is being built at full speed. The money is already committed. The seed capital is already raised. And the returns are barely keeping pace. There's a version of AI that Silicon Valley wants you to picture. A clean interface, a blinking cursor, a machine that thinks. The version they don't show you looks different. It's an open plan office in Nairobi, rows of workers, headphones on, staring at screens. They are not building the future. They are cleaning up after it. One piece of broken, violent, disturbing content at a time. This is the part of the AI supply chain that doesn't make it into the press releases. Before a large language model can answer a single question without embarrassing the company that built it, something has to happen behind the scenes. Every output has to be checked. Every harmful pattern has to be identified, labeled, and removed. The raw system, left entirely to itself, produces chaos, slurs, violence, explicit content, confident misinformation delivered in a polite, helpful tone. The gap between that raw system and the clean product you interact with every day is not filled by a machine. Oh, it's filled by people. Data labelers, content moderators, output verifiers, thousands of them, employed through third-party contractors in Kenya, the Philippines, India, and across Latin America. Their job is to read what the model produces, decide what's acceptable, and train it to do better. The work is repetitive and psychologically brutal. The pay would be illegal in the countries that own the companies demanding it. According to documented reports, content moderators in second and third world countries face a daily combination of poverty wages, psychological trauma, and active suppression of union organizing, conditions that would face regulatory intervention if they existed inside Western borders. Oh, but they don't exist inside Western borders. That's the point. In 2023, Time magazine broke a story that put a specific number on this. OpenAI had contracted a Kenyan firm called Sama Group to label toxic content for ChatGPT's training data. Workers were reading detailed descriptions of sexual violence, child abuse, and torture, hours at a stretch, for a wage of approximately $1.32 per hour. When workers began organizing to push back on the working conditions, the contract was terminated early. The workers lost their jobs. The model got cleaner. The product launched on schedule. That story didn't stay in the news cycle for long because it complicates the narrative in ways that are commercially inconvenient. The marketing language around AI has always been built around one word: autonomy. Machines that think, learn, and act, replacing human effort altogether. The image is clean, scalable, frictionless, a self-improving system that gets smarter on its own and requires less human input as it grows. The reality is layered in the opposite direction. The more capable the model becomes, the more important the human infrastructure underneath it gets. Because the smarter the system appears, the more damage a misaligned output can do, which means quality control doesn't shrink as AI scales. It expands. At the beginning of the AI boom, researchers discovered something quietly alarming. A large percentage of companies calling themselves AI startups weren't using any meaningful AI in their core product at all. In some surveys, that number was as high as 40%. That wasn't always deliberate fraud. In some cases, it was a company using simple automation tools or basic rule-based logic and calling it AI because the word opened doors. What it revealed was something important. From the very start, AI became a label more than a technology, a signal to investors, a justification for valuation, a story a company needed to have, whether or not the product underneath it warranted it. By 2024, around 78% of all companies reported using AI in some form. A year later, 61% of all global venture capital was flowing into AI-related businesses. You would expect returns at that scale of investment and adoption to be broad and consistent. Oh, they aren't. About 75% of the financial benefits are being captured by just 20% of companies. The rest are experimenting, deploying features, and integrating tools, without a clear path to transformation. In the early days, companies claimed AI without using it. Today, companies are using it, but can't explain how to make money from it. And that second problem is harder, because the first one, faking the technology, could be corrected by actually building it. The second one requires a business model that doesn't exist yet at scale. There's a concept in economics called the Jevons paradox. When a resource becomes more efficient to use, total consumption of that resource often goes up, not down, because more people use it more often. AI is running directly into this. As the tools get better and cheaper, usage expands faster than cost reductions. The efficiency gains don't accumulate into savings, they get absorbed by volume. More queries, more moderation, more infrastructure, more human labor at the base of the pyramid, doing the work the machines still can't do reliably, invisibly at scale. By 2024, a company called Scale AI had grown its contractor workforce to over 240,000 people globally, larger than most Fortune 500 employee headcounts. The company was valued at $13.8 billion. Almost none of that workforce receives benefits, equity, or job security. They are the engine, they are not the beneficiaries. The word artificial and artificial intelligence is doing a quiet amount of work, because the intelligence part, the part that impresses you, the part that gets the headlines, is sitting on top of something very old, a layered system of human effort organized at global scale, paid as little as possible, and kept as far out of frame as the marketing budget allows. The machine doesn't run itself. It never has. Forget the software for a moment. Forget the interface, the chat window, the blinking cursor waiting for your next question. Strip all of that away and ask what's actually happening when you hit send. Somewhere, a building the size of several city blocks just woke up. Processors fired, cooling systems surged, electricity moved through cables thick as your arm, water began cycling through pipes in the walls, and all of that happened in the fraction of a second before your answer started appearing on screen. For a single question, from a single user, in a system handling millions of simultaneous requests. This is not a cloud. There is no cloud. There are buildings, enormous, power-hungry, water-consuming buildings, and more of them are being constructed right now than at any point in human history. By 2022, data centers worldwide were already consuming roughly 460 terawatt hours of electricity every year. To put that in terms that mean something, that is the same amount of electricity used by an entire country the size of Germany or Japan, about 2% of total global demand from data centers alone. And that was before the current wave of AI infrastructure build-out had fully taken hold. By this year, that number is projected to hit somewhere between 620 and 1,000 terawatt hours, depending entirely on how fast AI keeps growing. Nobody is seriously betting on it slowing when you look at how that energy is actually being used inside a data center. The breakdown is not what most people expect. 40% goes to computation. That's the AI doing what you asked it to do, processing your input, generating your output, running the model, the part everyone pictures when they think about artificial intelligence. Another 40% goes to cooling. Not thinking, not learning, not generating anything, just keeping the machines cold enough to function. Because if the temperature inside those racks climbs past a certain threshold, the hardware fails permanently. The remaining 20% covers everything else, moving data between systems, maintaining network stability, keeping the facility from collapsing under its own operational complexity. Nearly half the electricity being poured into AI infrastructure isn't making it any smarter. It's keeping it alive. Now zoom out one level further. A single large hyperscale data center, the kind being built specifically for AI workloads, can consume 100 megawatts of power or more. 1 megawatt can typically power around 150 American homes. 100 megawatts, sustained over a year, is the equivalent electricity needed to charge well over 200,000 electric vehicles. For one building, there are over 8,000 data centers worldwide. A third of them sit inside the United States, and studies are now showing that the vast majority of these facilities are located in climates considered too warm for efficient operation, meaning the cooling systems are working harder, burning more electricity, spending more of that 40% just to fight the ambient temperature outside the walls. The power grid pressure this creates is not theoretical. In regions with concentrated data center development, Northern Virginia, Phoenix, Dublin, Singapore, local utility officials are being forced into a set of choices with no good answers. Do you expand the grid, adding infrastructure that takes years to build and billions to fund? Do you raise power prices for everyone on the same supply, including homes, schools, and hospitals? Do you cap new development and accept the economic and political backlash that follows? None of those options are clean, none of them are fast, and all of them were triggered by the energy appetite of an industry that largely doesn't live in the communities bearing the cost. Then there is the water. The same cooling systems consuming 40% of each facility's electricity often depend on an enormous, continuous flow of water cycling through the building to carry heat away from the hardware. This is not a design flaw, it is the most efficient solution currently available at this scale, but the volumes involved are staggering. A single large data center can consume millions of gallons of water per day, the equivalent of a town of 30 to 50,000 people, from one facility. Over a full year, even a mid-sized operation can burn through around 100 million gallons just to maintain operating temperature, and most of that water doesn't come back. In most evaporative cooling systems, between 70 and 80% of the water used is lost entirely. It's evaporated into the air, gone from the local water table permanently. Around 75 to 90% of data centers rely on water-based cooling, typically drawing from the same rivers, aquifers, and municipal supplies that serve the surrounding communities. In at least one town in Oregon, a single company's data center operations consumed more than 25% of the city's entire water supply, a city that had no meaningful say in whether that facility was built there in the first place. In Phoenix, Arizona, city planners formally imposed a moratorium on new data center water connections in 2023 after projections showed the sector would consume 40% of the city's available water supply by 2030. The moratorium was later partially reversed, following lobbying pressure. The industry knows this is unsustainable, which is why a quiet pivot has already begun, one you won't find in most coverage of the AI boom. Microsoft, Amazon, and Google have each signed agreements in the past 2 years to purchase power from nuclear facilities. Microsoft restarted Unit 1 of the 3 Mile Island plant in Pennsylvania. Yes, that 3 Mile Island, under a 20-year power purchase agreement specifically to supply its AI data centers. Amazon purchased a nuclear-powered campus in Pennsylvania outright. Google signed contracts for small modular reactor output that won't come online until the early 2030s. These companies are not making these moves because renewable energy is insufficient in theory. They're making them because renewable energy cannot deliver the consistent, uninterrupted, high-density power these facilities need at the scale they need it. Not yet, and not soon enough. The public messaging says 100% renewable by 2030. The contracts say something different. The same system promising a cleaner, smarter future is quietly betting that the answer to its energy problem is the most controversial power source of the last 50 years. And it's not asking anyone's permission. The physical limits of AI infrastructure are not a future problem waiting to arrive. They are already here, in the power bills of the towns sitting next to these facilities, in the water tables being quietly drawn down, in the utility meetings where no one from Silicon Valley shows up to answer questions. The cloud has a weight, and right now, the communities beneath it are starting to feel it. We've covered the money and the labor and the power. What comes next is the part the industry is least willing to discuss, because it's already happening inside your company, right now. There is a moment that happens in almost every workplace now. A deadline is closing in, the document isn't finished, the analysis isn't ready, the email needs to be perfect, and there are 20 minutes left. And sitting right there, one tab over, is a tool that can help. Fast, capable, and completely free to use. So you paste the document in, you get what you need, you meet the deadline. What you didn't think about, what almost nobody thinks about in that moment, is where that document just went. According to recent data, just under 35% of everything employees paste into AI tools now contains sensitive information. That number was just over 10% in 2023. In less than 2 years, the volume of confidential material being fed into commercial AI systems by ordinary workers has more than tripled. Legal documents, customer records, medical files, source code, internal contracts. A third of everything going into these systems is information that was never supposed to leave the building. and 83% of the companies where this is happening have zero technical controls in place to stop it. Not inadequate controls, not controls that need improving. 0. They send the policy emails, they run the compliance training, they put the slide up in the all-hands meeting that says be careful what you share with AI tools, and then the next morning they tell those same employees to be faster, more productive, more efficient, and they hand them access to the exact tools the compliance training warned them about. The employee now has to make a choice between the deadline and the policy. They pick the deadline every time because the deadline has consequences and the policy has a PowerPoint. The scale of what's already been lost is only starting to come into focus. Over 225,000 ChatGPT credentials have been found for sale on dark web marketplaces, harvested from compromised machines and password reuse across accounts. Major institutions including Apple, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs have moved to restrict or ban commercial AI tools internally after realizing what their employees had already been doing with them for months. The bans came after the exposure, not before it. Samsung learned this the hard way, and it learned it fast. In early 2023, 3 Samsung employees saw an internal email announcing that the previous ChatGPT ban had been lifted. The first interpreted this as permission and uploaded proprietary source code to debug a technical problem he was working through. The second copied detailed notes from a confidential internal meeting directly into the chat interface. The third used ChatGPT to help identify defective equipment in a semiconductor production line, pasting and process data that had never been intended to leave a secured network. All 3 thought they were being productive. All 3 were right by the narrow definition of the word. The work got done, the deadline was met. The ban came back within weeks. An internal Samsung survey conducted shortly after found that 65% of the company's own employees believed AI tools posed a serious security risk. They knew. They used them anyway, because the pressure to perform didn't pause while the security team wrote its report. In 2023, the United States Federal Trade Commission opened a formal investigation into ChatGPT's data practices, examining whether the system had violated consumer protection laws by retaining and misusing personal data. A 2024 FTC study found that major AI companies retained user data for an average of 3 years beyond the point at which users believed it had been deleted. Deletion requests in most cases removed the data from user-facing interfaces without removing it from training checkpoints already in use. The data wasn't gone, it was just hidden from the person who asked for it to be removed. But here's what most people still misunderstand about why this is worse than a typical data breach. When a company suffers a conventional breach, a server hacked, a database leaked, credentials stolen, the incident has a shape, it has a timestamp, it has a perimeter. You can identify what was taken, notify the affected parties, patch the vulnerability, and in most cases begin the process of containment and recovery. It is serious, it is damaging, but it is, in the technical sense, bounded. What happens when sensitive data is ingested into an AI training pipeline is different in kind, not just degree. On consumer plans, OpenAI's free and plus tiers, for example, users by default allow their conversations to be used to train future models. You can opt out, but opting out requires finding the setting inside a menu structure that most users never navigate. The default is participation, the default is contribution, and most people using these tools have never once opened the settings tab. Every contract snippet pasted in, every client detail typed out, every trade secret described in enough detail for the model to help with the problem. All of it becomes potential training material until the moment you actively choose otherwise. And once it's in, it cannot be taken back. In 2023, Italy became the first Western government to formally ban ChatGPT, citing GDPR violations related to the collection and processing of personal data without adequate legal basis. The Italian Data Protection Authority, the Garanti, opened a formal investigation and demanded OpenAI demonstrate compliance within 30 days or face a permanent block. OpenAI geo-restricted access to Italy within 24 hours, then negotiated a return by implementing a user-facing opt-out mechanism. The speed of that reversal told its own story. Oh, the legal exposure was real enough to act on immediately. What the Italian case revealed, and what subsequent EU investigations have continued to surface, is that the enterprise secure versions of commercial AI tools offered to corporate clients often route data through the same base infrastructure as the consumer product. The segmentation that companies are paying a premium for exists at the application layer. Underneath it, the plumbing frequently connects to the same place. The word enterprise in these contexts is, in several documented cases, a billing tier, more than a technical guarantee. Some security researchers have begun describing the aggregate of what's already happened. The credentials sold, the source code uploaded, the contracts pasted, the medical records typed into chat fields, as the largest uncontrolled corporate data leak in history. Not a single breach, a continuous, diffuse, self-inflicted exposure happening at millions of endpoints simultaneously, with no central event to point to and no clear moment at which the damage was done. The people inside these companies who are responsible for information security know exactly what's happening. They know the controls aren't in place. They know what it would take to fix it. The secure, in-house deployment running on dedicated hardware, maintained by a specialized team, isolated from the consumer infrastructure entirely. They also know what that costs. Millions of dollars in hardware, months of implementation time, specialized talent that is currently the most competed for category in the entire technology labor market. In the meantime, the deadlines keep coming. And the older executives, the ones who still think of these tools as glorified search engines, aren't asking the hard questions, because the productivity numbers look good, the quarterly reports look better, the compliance team's concerns stay inside the compliance team's meeting. Nobody wants to be the person who slows down a productivity wave by pointing out where it's actually going. So the wave continues, and somewhere in the wake of it, in a training dataset that no one will ever fully audit, is a piece of your company that was never supposed to leave the room. It already has. Every arms race in history has had the same psychological architecture. You move because they moved. They move because you moved. Nobody stops because stopping first looks like losing. And the moment you step back to ask whether any of this was necessary, you're already too far in to make the question mean anything. That is exactly the dynamic driving the AI infrastructure build out today, except the weapons are semiconductors, the battlefield is cloud capacity, and the people who end up paying for the ammunition are not the ones giving the orders. The real engine underneath all of this, and the thing that makes the arms race run, is chips, specifically the advanced graphics processing units that AI training and inference require in quantities the global supply chain was never designed to produce. And the companies selling those chips are not caught in the arms race. They are profiting from it handsomely, regardless of who wins. The global semiconductor industry is on a trajectory that would have seemed like fantasy a decade ago. In 2026, annual sales are expected to approach $1 trillion, an all-time high. Analysts are projecting $2 trillion by 2036. According to the chief executive of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the single most important chip manufacturer on Earth, demand for advanced AI chips is currently running at 3 times the available global supply. 3 times. Every major technology company is trying to lock in as much production capacity as possible, years ahead of delivery. New fabrication facilities being built in Arizona and Japan won't meaningfully ease the pressure until 2027 at the earliest, which means every company that wants to stay competitive right now is competing for a resource that simply does not exist in sufficient quantity and paying whatever price that scarcity demands. Here is where the psychology of the arms race becomes important to understand. Chip manufacturers have an enormous interest in companies believing there will never be enough compute, not because that message is false, it may be entirely accurate, but because a company that believes it will fall irreparably behind if it stops buying will keep buying regardless of whether the chips it already has are being fully used. The message doesn't need to be a lie to function as one. Oh, it just needs to be repeated at sufficient volume, through sufficient channels, with sufficient authority behind it. And it is repeated on earnings calls, at industry conferences, in testimony before Congress, in the language of every major technology announcement from every major technology company for the past 3 years. The result is a market where firms are ordering billions of dollars of GPUs years in advance, locking in supply they may not be able to fully deploy in the time frame they're paying for. Warehouses in Nevada and Texas are currently holding billions of dollars of advanced AI hardware and storage, waiting for the software infrastructure and the use cases to catch up with the purchasing decisions made 18 months ago. The chip companies collect the revenue either way. This pattern has a name, and it has a recent precedent that nobody in Silicon Valley seems eager to discuss. In the early 2020s, SoftBank's Vision Fund poured roughly $100 billion into technology startups under a single operating thesis. If you move fast enough, dominate a market completely, and make the competition irrelevant, profitability can come later. The companies that received that capital, WeWork, Uber, Katera, Greensill, moved fast. They dominated markets. Several of them collapsed anyway, or came within inches of it, once the cost structure of their businesses proved immune to the scale that was supposed to fix it. SoftBank wrote down over $32 billion. The founders largely exited before the reckoning. The concept driving today's AI build-out is structurally identical. Move fast, lock in the infrastructure, build the moat, trust that the business model arrives before the money runs out. The difference is the scale. WeWork's collapse was a $32 billion problem. The AI infrastructure build-out is a multi-trillion-dollar commitment, touching the retirement funds, energy grids, and economic stability of entire countries. There is a term for what happens in markets like this one. Economists call it narrative arbitrage. It describes the condition where the story of a technology, the future it promises, the fear of being left behind it generates, the consensus it creates among powerful actors, becomes worth more than the technology itself. When that happens, the story drives capital allocation independent of the underlying returns. And when the story eventually meets the financial reality, the correction isn't gentle. We have seen this before. In the late 1990s, an entire generation of investors and executives convinced themselves that internet infrastructure demand would grow fast enough to absorb the build-out happening in real time. Fiber optic cable filled entire buildings. Server farms expanded into cities. Valuations detached from earnings and stayed detached because the narrative said that earnings would arrive eventually, and that the companies that hesitated would be left behind. The Nasdaq lost 76% of its value when the correction came. Cisco, Intel, and Oracle saw their stock prices cut to fractions of their peak. Amazon and eBay survived by margins that, in retrospect, look almost accidental. The index took 15 years to reclaim its previous high. Not 15 months. 15 years. What made the dot-com correction devastating was not that the internet was fake. The internet was real. It changed everything. The timeline was wrong, and the valuations built on top of that timeline were wrong. And the capital that poured into those valuations was real money belonging to real people who were told they were making a safe bet on the future. Today, the money fueling the AI boom isn't primarily venture capital chasing asymmetric upside. It is embedded in the S&P 500. It is inside index funds. It is sitting in the retirement accounts of people who have never once thought about a semiconductor supply chain or a hyperscale data center lease agreement. When cycles like this turn, the architecture of the losses is predictable. The executives who built the companies get paid throughout. The early institutional investors find the exits before the doors close. The losses spread outward and downward to the mid-level employees whose equity evaporates, to the retail investors who bought in at the peak, to the pension funds that were told the exposure was diversified. The people making the decisions rarely take the hit. The hit lands on the people who trusted them to know what they were doing. And somewhere in a suburb somewhere, a 60-year-old woman who has spent 30 years contributing to a 401k that an advisor told her was diversified is about to find out how much of her retirement was quietly placed on a bet that the people making it couldn't actually explain. The race continues, the spending continues, the announcements continue. And the returns, the actual, consistent, economy-sustaining returns that would justify what has already been spent, are still arriving just over the horizon, where they have been every quarter for the past 4 years. At some point, the horizon has to move. Pull back from all of it for a moment. the financial math that doesn't close, the human labor hidden beneath the clean interface, the power grids bending under a demand they weren't built to carry, the data that left the building the moment someone hit a deadline, the arms race running on narrative more than returns. Pull back far enough, and a single question comes into focus. Not will AI work, it already works in the narrow technical sense. Not is the technology real, the technology is real. The question the industry is not asking, the one that gets treated as naive when someone outside the room raises it, is simpler and more dangerous than either of those. What happens when the thing that's overvalued isn't a website? The dot-com correction wiped out 76% of the Nasdaq's value. It destroyed companies, evaporated savings, and left a crater in the market that took 15 years to fill. But the internet as infrastructure kept running. The fiber stayed in the ground, the servers kept serving, the physical world absorbed the financial shock and continued operating. What was lost was capital. What remained was functional. Now consider what AI infrastructure has become in the 4 years since this build-out accelerated. It is load-bearing. The power grid supplying homes and hospitals are now also supplying the facilities running these systems. The water tables being drawn down for cooling supply. The same municipalities depending on them for drinking water. The retirement funds sitting inside index funds are now priced against the continued growth of companies whose entire valuation rests on an AI revenue curve that hasn't arrived yet. The employees using these tools have built workflows, deadlines, and productivity expectations around their continued availability. This is no longer a technology sector story. It became something larger, quietly, while the press releases were still talking about chatbots and image generators. History has a name for this condition. Economists call it systemic fragility, the condition where the parts of a system have grown so tangled together that when one fails, the failure doesn't stay local. It moves through everything connected to it. The 2008 financial crisis was not a mortgage crisis. It was a systemic fragility crisis, a moment when instruments that had been bundled, repackaged, and sold as safe turned out to be connected to everything, and when the underlying asset failed, the connection did the rest. The question nobody is asking is not whether AI will eventually generate the returns its infrastructure requires. It might. The technology may mature, the business models may arrive, the productivity gains may prove real and consistent and broad enough to justify what has been spent. The question is, what happens in the years between now and then? If they don't arrive on the schedule, the market has already priced in. Because the people who will answer that question are not the executives who ordered the GPUs. They are not the venture partners who funded the foundation models. They are not the semiconductor executives whose order books are full regardless of outcome. They are the people who trusted that the system knew what it was doing. The worker whose productivity is now measured against AI benchmarks that compress wages and eliminate roles before the replacement income materializes anywhere. The retiree whose fund manager described the S&P 500 as a safe, diversified vehicle while quietly loading it with AI infrastructure exposure. The family in the town next to the data center whose water bill is climbing and whose city council is being told the facility is bringing economic growth, which it is, but not for them. There is one more question underneath all of this, the kind that doesn't get raised at earnings calls or congressional hearings or industry panels where everyone on stage has already made their money. If the internet was real, but the timeline was a lie, if the technology genuinely changed the world, but the valuations built on top of the promise collapsed anyway, taking 15 years and trillions in wealth with them, what is the version of that correction when the overvalued thing is not a stock price, but the infrastructure your power grid depends on? When the thing that corrects is not a website that goes offline, but a supply chain for hardware that doesn't exist in sufficient quantity, or a water table that cannot be refilled on a quarterly earnings schedule, or a workforce whose skills were made redundant before the transition was complete. The honest answer is that nobody knows. Not the CEOs, not the analysts, not the researchers inside the labs. The people closest to this system will tell you in private that the variables are too interdependent and the timeline too compressed for anyone to model the failure modes with confidence. What they can model, or what the data already shows, is that the gap between what was promised and what is being delivered is not closing at the rate the infrastructure investment assumed. And that gap, if it persists, does not stay inside the technology sector. It spreads. The trillion-dollar bet has been placed. The chips are on the table. The infrastructure is being built faster than the questions are being answered. You are already in this system. Your power grid, your retirement account, your employer, your data, none of it opted out. None of it was asked. The least you can do is understand what you're in. Because the people running it are counting on you not to. If you want to understand what happens when these systems start making decisions that affect human lives, watch what we cover next.